Colleen Smith. I'm the Director of BehaviourWorks Australia, an applied behaviour change research unit based within the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, MSDI from now on for short. So on to our speakers. First of all, we have Kym Peake, and Kym is the Secretary of Victoria's Department of Health and Human Services. She's worked as Deputy Secretary of Higher Education and Skills Group at the Victorian Department of Education and Training, Deputy Secretary Governance, Policy and Coordination at the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet, Executive Director of Productivity and Inclusion in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Kym's on the board of the Institute of Public Administration Australia, and she has an Executive Master of Public Administration degree, a Bachelor of Arts with Honours and a Bachelor of Law, all from University of Melbourne. Welcome, Kym. Peter Singer is the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the University Centre for Human Values at Princeton University, and since 2005 he's combined this position with that of a Laureate Professor at the University of Melbourne. He also holds an adjunct position at Monash Bioethics Centre, which was formerly the Centre for Human Bioethics, which Peter founded in 1980 during a 20-year career at Monash University. Peter has variously been described as the most dangerous man in the world and as the world's most influential living philosopher. He's authored dozens of books, including seminal works like Animal Liberation, Practical Ethics, and more recently, The Life You Can Save. Can you please welcome both our speakers? I guess I've spoken to both of you independently about behaviour change, and you've come to have an interest in behaviour change, and I'm interested to know how that came about. Maybe start with you, Kym.
Sure. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Really, every part of the work that I've done in government has been heavily influenced by two big ideas. The first really draws from Amartya Sen's work on capabilities and the notion that people really need capabilities in order to lead a life that they have reason to value. And I think that concept is particularly relevant for the Department of Health and Human Services, whose aspiration is to improve the health and well-being of all Victorians, but particularly those who face the most barriers to having a good life. And a capabilities frame enables us to remain very focused on how we build agency in people's lives to be able to have a focus on capabilities, as well as really thinking about both the individual behaviours that might need to change, as well as community attitudes and behaviours that need to change for those capabilities to be realised. And the second really strong influence on the way I think about the role of government and the way we approach the work that we do in the public service is really been influenced by system thinking and system scientists, and a recognition that the way we live our lives is invariably within systems, our families, our communities, how we interact with service systems and with the systems of government and the economy. And that as we, as policymakers, think about the advice we give government, the services that we design and deliver, if we aren't cognisant of wicked problems existing in the context of a variety of ecosystems, how those ecosystems operate, and the way in which our actions influence the behaviour of people within those ecosystems, then we've got very little prospect of actually creating the conditions that enable those capabilities to be realised. And so for me, behaviour, human behaviour, really sits at the intersection between those two big ideas about the role of government in enabling and equipping the development of capabilities and the way in which ecosystems affect and influence the ability not only for basic capabilities but for capabilities such as living free from discrimination in a politically free world, and in a way that we have the most effect through our policies. So it's really the way in which behaviour intersects with those two other kind of concepts that I'm particularly interested in.
Peter?
Yes, so ever since I got involved in philosophy, I have been interested in the applied side of it, in political philosophy and ethics, but also not just ethics at the theoretical level of trying to understand what it is we're doing when we make moral judgments, but in trying to think about how we ought to live. And in doing that, I've come to some conclusions that are contrary to the way most people behave. So, for example, in looking at questions about the moral status of animals, I've come to the conclusion that we're treating them in ways that are not justifiable, and a part of that, in fact a very large part of that, is the way we raise them for food. And it follows from that I think we ought not to be complicit in those ways of raising them for food, and that means that we ought to change our eating habits and either become vegetarian or vegan, or at the very least avoid factory farmed animal products. So that's one example. The other major area, I guess, of practical life where there's a clear change is that from very early on, I've thought that we in the affluent countries are not doing nearly enough to help people in extreme poverty elsewhere in the world. And I've argued that not only should governments do more, but since governments seem reluctant to really do substantially more in that area, it's up to us as individuals, that at least those of us who are middle class or above in affluent societies have the capacity to reach into our pockets or go online and actually assist effective organisations that are making a significant difference in the lives of people who are, whose lives are just incomparably more constrained by resources than ours are. So having reached those conclusions, and being somebody who is thinking about the consequences of what we ought to do, is that part of my underlying utilitarian framework, it follows that it's not enough to just say, well, these are the things we ought to do. I'm interested also in asking, and how do we actually get people to do these things? And it turns out, surprise, surprise, that it's not enough simply to put a rational argument out there and have everybody follow it. So inevitably then you get involved in questions about, well, what else would have an impact, and are there any ethical constraints on those other ways of having an impact? And that, I think, is what we're here to talk about tonight.
Peter, were your books written to change people's behaviour?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly, if you start out with, say, my second book, we'll leave the Oxford thesis book that I wrote out of it, but the second book that I wrote was Animal Liberation. And although I got interested in that issue as a philosopher, and there is some philosophy in that book in terms of looking at different ways of viewing animals and discussing their moral status and how we ought to treat them, by the time I got around to writing that book, I was certainly trying to reduce the amount of suffering we inflict on animals, and to do that it was certainly necessary to change people's behaviour. And as I say, perhaps when I started out I thought, well, if I set out the facts here, put a few rational arguments out, maybe include a couple of photographs of what factory farm conditions are like, that'll be enough to change people's behaviour. I mean, interestingly, it is enough to change some people's behaviour. When I speak, I quite often get somebody coming up to me and saying, I read Animal Liberation and became a vegetarian. But that's one or two people. It's not the kind of really large change that you would need to end the things that I think are unjustified ways of treating animals.
Kym, you recently went to Harvard and did a course. What did you learn there? What was the course about, and what did you learn there?
So the course was a behavioural insights course, and it was particularly focused on nudge and the ways in which government may deploy nudge techniques to try and affect people's behaviour. Not surprisingly, the first observation I really had was just the point that Peter's made, that so many assumptions that underpin all of our policy work about convincing people through evidence and rational argument don't bear out in the sort of research that actually then tracks through how people react and behaved. And the next kind of observation, which again probably isn't very surprising, was when you take better account of some of the evidence around loss aversion and people's preponderance to follow through if they've made a commitment, and if they believe that the action is consistent with the general norms of others, that behavioural insights by itself I don't think is either going to be the solution to changing behaviour, and that embedding that understanding alongside all of the other policy techniques that we use, whether it's human-centred design or how we use data differently, that's important too. But Perhaps the overwhelming reflection I had from the week was you cannot separate this conversation tonight about how government considers behavioural evidence and uses it without answering a more fundamental first question about what you think the role of government is. And I was so struck over the week that it was a fascinating course, really got a lot out of it, but every case study and every example was based on how to influence an individual's behaviour or an organisation's behaviour. And I think that was very linked to a perception of the role or a frame of the role of government as a smaller role of government. And I would say more than 50% of my job is, for both sides of government, both political parties, has much more been about system stewardship in the last 5 or 6 years. And there really was no discussion about how individuals behave within systems collectively, and therefore how policy and government actions influence the behaviour of those ecosystems, not just the sort of getting someone to pay their tax on time or save for their retirement. So that I'm kind of really interested in Peter's sort of observations on the work that he's done over so many years and how it extrapolates across to thinking about the kind of communities and service systems and system of government, knowing that systems, as soon as they're created, kind of eat themselves.
Yeah, and I certainly think that's important. I have mostly been sort of directing the writing that I've been doing at individuals, partly because I think it's so hard to get governments to shift, as I was saying in the example of foreign aid. You would like, or I would like anyway, governments to give more foreign aid, provided that they also use it effectively. But a lot, certainly in Australia, we've been going backwards on that over the last few years. We're giving less and less foreign aid as a percentage of our gross national income than we did in many years. So that's why I've been sort of asking people to think about this issue as individuals. But certainly the government structures and the institutions we have can have a huge effect. And if you're in a position to influence that, as you are certainly, Kym, then I think that's a great opportunity to really make important changes for good, provided, of course, we do comply with the various ethical constraints.
Which we hope to explore soon.
Yeah.
I guess I'm interested in turning our attention to what I think is a really first and fairly key important question, which is, do governments have the right or indeed obligation to change behaviour? And if so, where does the border lie? How far do we push it? So obviously, as we introduced, it's a good idea to change behaviour for greater health, wealth or prosperity. Is that the role of government? Do we have a right to do that? Or indeed, if the benefits are really significant, do we actually have an obligation to do that? I guess a question to both of you.
Well, I can start if you like. And this does relate to what you just said, Kym, about differences in approach in the United States, perhaps, and Australia or the European democracies. Because at least some people in the United States would have the idea that, well, governments serve to protect these rights. We've got a Bill of Rights, and that's what governments are supposed to do. And basically, they shouldn't go beyond that, or they don't have perhaps a right to go beyond that. But I think the view that I hold would be that governments do have a duty to promote the well-being of the people over whom they are governing. Again, provided, of course, that they're not violating some set of constraints, which may be put in terms of rights. But if they're not, then, and they have an opportunity to do good, to make people healthier or happier or live more sustainably, whatever it might be, then I think they should be doing that. I think they'd be lacking in their duties and in their role if they said, no, we don't have any reason to do this. So I would say where you see those opportunities, where they're clearly on balance going to produce more good than harm, and where you're complying with those other ethical constraints, that is what governments should be doing.
And I don't think there's going to be a debate on this point at all,
Right.
because, no, I think in my conception of what the role of government is, or what the role of government is to do, there's kind of 4 key roles that intrinsically are involved in behaviour change. The first is trying to get people and organisations to comply with rules. The second is to try and maximise the impact and utilisation of services that we think can make a positive difference in people's lives. The third is to really try and get the various actors, and in my world, that's the different service providers and communities as a whole, to really work differently, to work together, and so to get to design the settings which influence the behaviour of systems. And then the fourth is really one that's maybe a bit more contested, but is around really promoting good citizenship. And that's everything from attitudes to animal rights, through to violence against women, through to Aboriginal self-determination, and a society that is open and not discriminatory. The reason I say perhaps that one is more contested is I think that's where there is more of the debate about how far government goes in really trying to influence social norms as opposed to reacting to social norms. But I think that there is, my personal view is that there is an incredibly important role in if we are going to prevent harm and if we are going to reduce downstream costs in that primary prevention space.
So I'm kind of interested in, Peter, you said more good than harm. I think you said what we thought was a good thing to do. I'm interested in pushing that a little bit to understand how do we make those judgments, on what basis? I mean, in the past, governments have decided that homosexuality was the wrong thing to do and delivered behaviour change programs to prevent those. And clearly we look back at that now and think it's abhorrent, but I guess I'm curious to know how we decide and what code we use to say what's good and what's bad and what's a good thing to do.
Yeah. Do you want to start off on that one?
Yeah. So look, I think that there is inevitably a push and pull in that. I think that there is a reference to social norms that is important, and governments are elected in Western democracies, and if they are completely out of step with those social norms, there's a pretty swift electoral reaction, let alone any ethical consideration. But by the same token, I do think there's a really important leadership role of government. And if I just take family violence as an example, my view would be that the reason that family violence has become so much more prominent in our social discourse in the last few years is the convergence of two really important factors. The first was the really emblematic leadership of Rosie Batty, a circumstance where, a really horrific, tragic incident, but that her reaction to it that was non-blaming, was very relatable and very considered, meant that people connected with the issue she was raising in the community. And then there was strong political leadership that came in with investment behind that to say this is an issue that both rationally and at an emotional level people can connect with and get behind. And probably NDIS is the other example in my time in government where you've got that convergence between very strong political leadership tapping into a sufficient vein of community sentiment, but perhaps is a bit latent without the political leadership to tip into a different sort of community conversation. And I think it's through that community conversation that you then get the authorising environment to make the judgments about how far government then goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the role of government is really important in helping to move some of these norms. I mean, to take your example about homosexuality, the first thing governments had to do was repeal the criminal law, which was making sodomy a criminal offence. So that's a start. Now, you could say to some extent that was a response to already changing norms, but it certainly pushes things further. And then you start to get active promotion of non-discrimination, of non-prejudicial activities and so on, to the point where you get other institutions actually promoting gay pride and the AFL doing stuff like that and so on. So I think government has an important role in helping those norms to shift and in encouraging other bodies, making it acceptable for other bodies to help to shift those norms as well. And clearly that's also true of domestic violence, but going back beyond that, we have the idea of equality between men and women, which is clearly crucial, because if you have the view that a woman's job is to say yay and nay and to obey her husband or whatever, then you don't get to first base on that one.
And actually, just to Peter's point about the enabling kind of role, it's not only the political leadership, but it's the enabling the community activism or disabling it that creates the environment where new norms can start to emerge and then be fanned to life.
Yeah, I'm interested, so just to change tack slightly, I'm interested in the role of evidence in underpinning government behaviour change action. As someone who comes from the academy, I guess the creators of evidence, we would like to see evidence used more often, but there are often times where the evidence isn't acted on, and then other times it is. And I'm interested in your thoughts about, when is it a trigger? And for example, we have evidence that people who eat sugary or drink sugary drinks or exercise less or even eat red meat may cause be linked to climate change or greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So the evidence for all those things, why don't we intervene on those or more than we do?
And look, I think evidence is incredibly important. I also don't think it's sufficient. And I guess the two examples that I tried to draw on around disability and family violence, that the reality is that we knew for many, many years how many women were being killed every year. And that fact, that evidence in and of itself, we knew that gender inequality was the basis upon which violence was happening in our community. That evidence base wasn't enough to build that emotional connection in the community. So some of it is, I think, about how an issue becomes relatable to people, and that's why I think Rosie was so important, Della Bosca in disability, that there were public stories that people could connect to, which then brought the evidence behind to say this is also of such magnitude that it's that the sort of investment logic is then built up for a case for government. But the reality is that most government decision making is informed by evidence but not determined by evidence.
It's going to vary though, isn't it, with particular cases and cases where the evidence is of harm to our own health. I think maybe that's often enough to motivate people and get a campaign, and tobacco is the obvious example there, that the evidence became overwhelming and government started acting on it, and so we end up with, say, the kind of cigarette packaging we have here, which is very strong. I was just having lunch with an American who had looked at the cigarette packets and was pretty amazed that what we require the cigarettes to have. So we've made a very successful change in that area, and I think probably really mostly it was getting the evidence out there, maybe getting it out there in a pretty vivid form in terms of some of that advertising. Whereas, say, you mentioned the case of red meat, and you linked that to climate change, and you're right, there is a clear evidence there, but it's not so clear that people are going to alter their behaviour, or at least let's say that most people are going to alter their behaviour on the basis of, oh, I'm contributing to climate change. And we see that in various other ways apart from what people eat. So, I think there is a health aspect to red meat as well, and it's linked to cancers of the digestive system, but if we were just to focus on those environmental factors, I think it might not be enough, and maybe we do need somehow more kinds of techniques to change behaviour, make it more salient to people as to what climate change is doing.
I was just going to say, I think both the salience point, but also how you build up that notion that other people are interested in this is, so those learnings from the behavioural science are really important. I was down in Warrnambool yesterday, and their health service there has seen a really dramatic uptake of their both cancer screening services and then their interventions because it's now provided locally. And farmers were making the choice to live for a shorter period of time because they could live at home and because none of their peers were going and getting tested. So just on if it's your own health, you take it more seriously, maybe, but I think there's other factors that influence that decision as well.
So I guess that's trying to capture some of the key thoughts around this idea of, do we have the right? We didn't get to the question actually, Peter, about obligation. I know you sometimes talked about...
I think I use the term duty, but I regard duty and obligation as as equivalent. So I think it is the government's duty to take steps to ensure the well-being of the population, and well-being may refer to material standards of living, but obviously may refer to health, both physical and mental. And I think where government has opportunities to do that at reasonable cost, and as I say, without violating other constraints, which we can talk about, then I think that is the obligation of government to do that.
Can I just add one thing? I think it's really interesting when we think about the ethical considerations in the trade-offs that we have to make in government about where to spend the discretionary dollar, of which are heavily rationed, that we're really self-conscious about the perspective that we bring to that. And having worked in 5 different government departments, the assumptions that underpin that are very different if you're in an education department, and your purpose is really about supporting the majority of as many of the population as possible to build literacy, numeracy and educational capability. Then if you're in a Department of Human Services where your focus tends to be on how do we put the marginal dollar to assist the most in need. And the reason I raise that is because I think one of the important ethical considerations that we need to bring to behavioural change is being very self-conscious about that, and are we focusing our behavioural change efforts on helping the most, or are we focusing our behavioural change efforts on helping the most in need? And if we are having an eye to distributive justice in how we think about behavioural insights and ethical considerations, then I think it's incredibly important that transparency becomes even more at the fore when we know through a whole lot of studies that people who are under extreme stress, it translates into a tangible effect on decision-making capability. I think it's incredibly important that the sorts of interventions that we make are not further stigmatising a particular group. So if we're thinking about trying to encourage women not to smoke when they're pregnant, that perhaps framing around healthy pregnancy rather than labelling a group of smoking pregnant women as kind of bad is important, that we're not further disadvantaging a group. So we know some of the wellness incentives tend to be much more taken up by higher socioeconomic groups than lower socioeconomic groups. We talked before we came on stage today about healthy eating, and we can have all sorts of nudges to try and get people to make healthier food choices. If they can't afford fresh food, is that choice real and available to them? So I am kind of very conscious that the starting kind of view on the role of government and the starting view on how, you know, our purpose, who we're trying to help, gives rise to different ethical considerations as well.
Can I push you a little bit on the spending of the marginal dollar? Partly because I'm interested because, well, you just said you spent time at Harvard and you've mentioned Amartya Sen. So Harvard was the home of the late John Rawls, who was a very influential American philosopher, and in fact he cites Sen's early work in his major book, A Theory of Justice. So they're connected. But Rawls puts the view that we ought to focus on the least advantaged, that essentially in terms of distribution, the focus should be on raising the minimum level, sometimes called maxi-min, raising the minimum level of society, rather than on, as utilitarians would say, maximising the overall benefit. And that's a pretty significant divide. So, for example, if you really take Rawls seriously, and I think, you know, most people when it comes down to it might back away from this, but if there was one group that was at the bottom, and at very great expense you could raise them just a little bit, but only a very small bit. And there was a much larger group that was not at the bottom, though maybe not at the top either, but a much larger group, and for the same amount of money you could raise many more people, significantly more than you were raising the people at the bottom. Rawls' view is you still have to focus on those at the bottom. So you're getting a smaller overall benefit, but you're helping the people who are worst off. And I was wondering whether you were suggesting that that works in the health department, or that you would still have some trade-off relating to the size of the benefit.
Yeah, and really my point was firstly being very self-conscious about what your starting assumption is on that question, So if we work in child protection, alcohol and drug, mental health, public housing, many of the functions that we're responsible for in human services, you would fall on the rules side of the fence. And if you worked in health, I think the really interesting question is we have historically not been very good at really using data to say who are the large consumers of our acute health services. And within that, who are the people who are being readmitted or whose admissions could have been avoided. And actually a large cost in the public health system are our human service clients who are not engaging with primary or community care, who have not got the community supports to follow up when they're discharged from hospital. And so actually even there, applying the Rawlsian kind of approach actually has quite significant relevance to how we both get better health outcomes but also avoid costs in the health system. Now, the health department, my colleagues would not want me to say that's universally at the expense of helping, but helping many people, but it is a legitimate consideration and it's certainly the weight we would put in most of human services.
I want to bring us back to behaviour change, and particularly around the type of tools. So I think we've had a bit of a discussion, and given social norms or some leadership or perhaps evidence or combinations of those three, governments have the right or indeed obligation to act. The question then becomes, if that's true, then what tools are appropriate in their toolkit? And some, i.e. the provision of information, I think may be useful in some circumstances, but in many is not, in fact. Peter made that point at the start. So there are a whole suite of other tools, and I just wanted to explore a little bit about where the line crosses in terms of what government does and doesn't do. Are there circumstances where it's okay to lie? This is a sign that a colleague of mine in the audience, Jim, and I were involved in putting up many years ago at Port Campbell National Park. Essentially, it was asking people to stay on the track so they didn't fall off the cliff, essentially, or damage vegetation. This sign was proved to be fairly effective, but essentially there was no photographer in this instance. A big reward for a small white lie. Is this okay? Kym?
So I don't think so, and I don't think so for two reasons. I think that we already know we live in a time where there is deteriorating trust in government and in other institutions. And I think as soon as we justify the end by, justify the means for an end, we are in difficult territory about where that line keeps moving to. And I think there is always plenty of stories, examples, evidence that is truthful, that enables us to tell a compelling story or make a compelling point. So as my line is, no lies.
Right. As a utilitarian, Peter?
So as a utilitarian, I would have to agree you could give me a hypothetical example where the benefits were so clear and the risk of the lie becoming known and therefore leading to further distrust was so minimal, and there was no other way to achieve those benefits, that I would probably accept it. But I don't see why in this case you didn't actually just find a friendly photographer and get in to come for a walk and show him all the great shots he could take from that path and get him to sign on to something like that.
That's right. Well, the other kind of practical example I was going to give is just so much of behaviour change that is relevant in health and human services is going to be a professional imparting advice or information to a client or a patient or a victim survivor. And again, I think if behavioural change, either through writing or advice, is tainted by a mistruth and that does become known, then that relationship is irreparably harmed. So institution damage, but I think the kind of, the basis of the relationship, it's just not worth it.
Onto a second example around subliminal or hidden messaging. I don't have one to show, but I'm interested in that as a case study. So, there's some initial use of subliminal messaging was sort of cutting one frame in 24 into a sequence or something that you saw, essentially selling products, and was rapidly banned. But there are other forms of hidden or subliminal messaging that can be quite powerful, and indeed for positive results. For example, studies showing that, you know, when students sit exams, if they have a watermark or a picture of Rodin's The Thinker, or indeed someone winning a race, they can perform better than if they didn't have those. Are these tools in our toolkit, Peter?
I think they're dubious. They're certainly they're not, you know, along the line of putting up this subliminal image of, you know, that says drink Coca-Cola or something like that, and then finding that people in the movies buy more Coca-Cola. I think that's clearly rightly banned. The question is, why are you having a watermark here if this is the exam paper? Why does it have a watermark at all? And is the watermark an attempt to manipulate people in some way that is unconscious to them? And it clearly seems from this example that it is. So I'm doubtful about doing that. It may be that you can arrange the examination room in ways that encourage students to concentrate and to perform well. That's acceptable, I think. But in terms of putting images there where they wouldn't normally be images, I doubt that. I think it's different from some of the other kinds of techniques which involve setting defaults in one way rather than another, because you know, there has to be some sort of default in many situations. Maybe we'll talk about some of those examples. But I think this is more manipulative, and I question it.
Look, I completely agree. I think that principle of transparency and the principle of empowering choice rather than there being manipulation is again got to be a kind of fundamental principle of how government uses this understanding of behaviour.
So on to probably one that's less controversial. I guess some would argue that the role of government is to provide information, or as much information as possible to allow citizenry to make their own decisions. But I guess we know from behavioural science things like choice overload, and if you give people too much, that can actually be quite detrimental and in fact paralyses them. They don't make any choice at all. So in some senses we have to choose information that we impart. So in that case, which information do we choose?
So again, I think that there's two bits to it, isn't there? There's salient information that's sort of, it's the same as when you're advising a decision maker. It's the information that is going to be both helpful and relevant to the choice that you're asking someone to make. And it being, and I'm with Peter, I'm completely comfortable about then using the understandings from behavioural science to how that is presented and framed to enable people to absorb it in a positive way. So, yeah, I mean, for me, these kind of examples really go to the heart of kind of the ethical principles around being open, being transparent, but understanding how people take in information to be so that you are being as useful as possible, helpful as possible.
Yeah, clearly you can't present all of the information, but I think you ought to be presenting the information that is, firstly, that has got a good evidence base, obviously, and secondly, that is, you know, reasonable people would think is most relevant to the decision that is being made. So, I mean, in some of these cases, maybe there's information about treatments that would be life-saving, or having checkups that are, you know, very likely to save a lot of lives at various stages. But maybe, you know, 1 in 5 million of those goes wrong, and there's some lasting damage done to the person who goes. I don't know that you need to mention those tiny risks that are going to clearly be offset by the benefits to the vast majority of people. But it is a matter of judgment as to when the risks get serious enough so that they should be disclosed.
And for whom? And
for whom, I guess that's right too.
Yeah, and I guess government employees are making those judgments all the time, and they have to. They need some kind of moral code or assessment that they.
And I think really just generally adopting an approach where we're very clear about the objectives that we're trying to achieve. We're very clear about the the evidence behind the intervention we're proposing, and we take account of those various ethical considerations that would be relevant to the different sort of options we have in front of us. Is it something that's going to marginalise or further stigmatise? Is it something that is manipulative rather than informative? And different of the examples you're using, we're going to have different ethical considerations that are relevant. If we're quite self-conscious about not just testing, is there an evidence that this is going to achieve the end, but have we applied the ethical tests to the means, then I'm really comfortable that there's a rich vein of different types of techniques that we can use.
We mentioned defaults a couple of times, obviously in the news quite recently with My Health Record. Have we done the right thing on My Health Record?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I'm personally very comfortable with the opt-out model. I think one thing that I would say is how important it is that we provide absolute good, timely and clear information so people understand both what they need to weigh up and the process to opt out, and we make it a real option to opt out. We make it easy to opt out. But I think, this is where I probably would be more on the utilitarian side, that the clear clinical benefits with appropriate safeguards around that information mean that after 15 years of talking about this, setting a default that is advancing what is going to lead to better clinical outcomes, I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, people sometimes object that setting defaults to change behaviour is paternalistic, but I think it, exactly as Kym said, if you give people plenty of opportunity to opt out, you make sure that they're informed about their opportunity to opt out, it's an easy thing to do, they don't have to go through a very complicated procedure, then it's not actually constraining free choice. It's simply saying, in both cases, people would be choosing, they would have to choose to have their health records put into that system and universally accessible, or they would have to choose not. So I think it's just changing the choice options, and I would agree with that. But I do have a question for you, Kym, and that is just along the lines of what you said about giving people the choice. What about with organ donations? Right? Many countries have an opt-out system now for saying, essentially, if you're in an accident and brain dead, and you haven't opted out, then your organs are available to save someone else's life. And that has been shown to increase the availability of organs. We don't have that in Victoria, or indeed anywhere in Australia.
Yeah, and again, I would be very comfortable with that as long as all those preconditions that you just mentioned are available, so that the process for opting out isn't that you need to have known that this exists and go and find the place where you have to opt out. That I think in some countries there's a link to when your licence is renewed, that it's something that you can tick the box, I opt out at this point, but it's a prompt for people and an easy process for people to participate in. Again, I think that is not causing harm. It is advancing a significant benefit to the community as long as people actually are able to exercise choice.
I want to move on to another example. That's it. This is a campaign that's run in Queensland. It's called If You Smoke, Your Future's Not Pretty. You can upload a photo of yourself and quote, see how old and horrible you look if you continue to keep smoking. Particularly targeted young women and designed to reduce smoking rates. Based on good evidence, I would hope, so not lying, but nonetheless potential to cause other harms. Is this okay? Start with you, Kym.
So again, my preference is not to either kind of make lifestyle choices, make moral judgments on lifestyle choices, or to kind of name a group of people as the vehicle to affect behavioural change. So wouldn't be my first choice. It's not even so much that I have a kind of ethical wobble, radar wobble to it, but I think the more that we move into that sort of sort of labelling a group of people and their behaviour as bad, the slipperier slope it is into just more generally talking about homosexuality as bad or, other sort of lifestyle choices as defining you. So I'd probably think that there are, other ways, mind you. If you think about the labelling on cigarette packs and the graphic images, that it has been it's been part of a suite of initiatives that have made a difference.
Yeah, I guess there's two differences between this and the cigarette packages. One is that this is specifically targeted at young women, as you said, and there isn't a comparable thing for young men. And it also reinforces this idea about how important it is to look good. It's a kind of reinforcing that idea about the importance of beauty, and maybe we already have plenty of reinforcement in this society from commercial vendors of products. And so that's another reason why I would also really agree with Kym. I'm reluctant to do it. And once again, if you could convince me that this was really going to save a lot of lives, this was uniquely effective as compared to other kinds of advertising which would not save as many lives, then I might be persuaded that despite those concerns, it would be worth it. But I would really need good evidence that you can't do this another way.
I want to move on to another topic briefly. I'm conscious we don't have lots more time, but it's around, I guess, a foundational knowledge in behavioural science is that tailoring programs to specific target audiences, much like this one with young women, can be quite effective. I guess, and I guess government holds a lot of data about their citizenry, and we could certainly mine that data to design better and more targeted behaviour change programs. But yet there's a certain public concern around governments doing that, and particularly we saw that play out with Cambridge Analytica. Is it okay to mine data to design more tailored programs?
And look, I think this is a really, really important question to ask, and I think the answer is going to be not a universal yes or no. I think again, it comes down to whether there are alternatives, and I think some of Peter's writing around really weighing up, is there another way to achieve the same end, is relevant to this question. But I can give a couple of really practical examples of where we have linked data that's influenced an intervention that's changed behaviour in a really positive way, one that we've done with you guys around really understanding how to raise Indigenous immunisation rates, both the channels and the sorts of messages that would resonate. Also in child protection, we are doing a body of work that is combining administrative data sets to really not replace professional judgment, but be an input to professional judgment in risk assessment. And they are two kind of practical examples where linked data is being linked to a behaviour change approach. And in both of those cases, I think it's both defensible and actually necessary to get better outcomes for a group of clients. But I'm really uncomfortable with I'm really uncomfortable with the where you can take this kind of work, and the sort of stuff in the US elections where not only was there kind of real targeting of what were the known voting issues for particular groups, but actually how might you dissuade groups of voters from voting as well, just points to the enormous risks in this space.
So I guess the question is, can we mine my health data to design better behaviour change programs?
Yeah, and I look, to be honest, I think if we started doing that, given the level of concern that is already very evident in the community about providing electronic health records, that would be the quickest way to have people opting out. So maybe it does go back to that earlier conversation about you've got to be in step with kind of social norms to some extent to have the authorising environment to make that decision about when are there other options, or when is this the best way to achieve an outcome.
Although it's interesting, isn't it, that social norms have changed a lot in the privacy area, at least as far as the corporate area is concerned, in terms of what we're prepared to tell Google, for example. I saw a New Yorker ad not long ago, which a car has crashed into a fire hydrant, and a couple have got out, a man and a woman have got out, and the woman has pulled out her phone. He says, "That's interesting. I'm getting ads for new cars, optometry testing, and couples counselling." And when you look at the ads, if you do allow Google that information, as I do, because I'm not that worried about Google abusing it, it is interesting what Google knows about you, right? And it is interesting what Google is giving you relevant information, which is helpful in many cases. And I don't really mind. I don't have this strong sense of preserving privacy about those things anyway. So maybe eventually, I agree you want my health records to settle down in a sense, but maybe eventually you'll be able to get people's consent to allow you to use that information for their benefit and others.
And I think that's key, isn't it? That there's a process of people feeling confident that there is a consent, and I think in the particulars of health, people are still very anxious about what might be used with health information from an employment perspective or an insurance perspective. And therefore they're much less comfortable to enable even what might be health-related purposes because of where it might go next.
Yeah, that's true.
Nearly at the end, but Cass Sunstein, who co-authored the book Nudge and has indeed sort of tested the acceptability of nudges in many, many countries, largely showing that the citizenry are broadly acceptable or accepting of nudge strategies, recently came up with the idea of a Bill of Rights. And these are those that they should be, that behaviour change or nudge approaches should be consistent with the values and interests of the audience, only be done for good, must not violate individual rights. Transparency is needed, although he notes that when you run randomised control trials, that there are control groups that are perhaps unaware of the situation, and also must not take things away from people without their consent. I'm interested in your reflections on these as a sort of a moral code for when and how we apply behaviour change strategies. Peter?
Yeah, well, I think you can look at that and you can probably for yourself see some issues about it, consistent with the values and interests of the audience. Well, we've been talking about governments and others actually moving values in positive directions on issues like homosexuality. So it depends what you mean by consistent, sort of within the broad range in some way, not stepping too far ahead, yes, but not simply consistent in the sense of echoing. Must not violate individual rights. Well, exactly what rights do individuals have? Are they absolute? I really don't think rights can be absolute in where it's the only way to prevent overwhelming catastrophe, example. I think we are justified in violating what would otherwise be individual rights. Transparency, I'm happy to agree with, and there is that qualification that sometimes you need to do randomised trials where you can't tell people which arm of the trial they're in. But the last one, it's pretty obvious that governments take away things from people without their consent all the time, isn't it? I mean, do we have to consent to our tax money being taxed? I don't think so. So I think a lot of that is too sweeping. But some of them are clearly going in the right sort of direction with qualifications.
And I think that the couple of things that Peter, I know you've written about that don't leap off the page is a really strong statement, sort of in there, but the strong statement about not manipulating people, the strong statement about the choice of the intervention that you make. Is there an alternative that would achieve the same end? Is this going to be the best way? Or is there something that perhaps doesn't require nudging of people? And the last one that I feel really strongly about is the one I raised earlier about the the distributive justice element. So it might be that you can sign off on all of these for the population as a whole, but if the nudge is going to adversely affect a part of the population or stigmatise a part of the population, then it wouldn't pass my test.
Well, I'd really like to thank Kym and Peter. Can we give them a round of applause? I guess I'd particularly like to thank you, Kym, in participating in the conversation. It's not always easy for a public representative to speak so frankly. It's a bit easier for academics to sort of stand on the sideline and comment. So I really appreciate your contribution, and thank you all for coming.